History tells us the Knights Templar vanished in the early 14th century. Arrested, tortured, executed, dissolved. That is the official ending. Clean, final, convenient. But every official ending depends on a silent assumption that everything of value was taken as when the men were taken. That once the bodies are in chains, the story is over. History does not support that assumption. When the arrest began in France on Friday the 13th, 1307, royal officials entered the Templar vaults expecting unimaginable wealth. Gold, silver, relics, archives. They expected the kind of treasure that makes kings feel small. They found emptiness. The treasury at the Paris Temple was nearly bare. Not poor, not modest, bare in a way that raises a professional question. Who empties a fortress before the police arrive? The records were missing too. Not just account books, charters, letters of credit, loan contracts, the paperwork that proved who owed what, the paperwork that could embarrass a crown. And then there was the sea. At La Rochelle, one of the most strategic ports in medieval Europe, the Templars had ships, not fishing boats, transport vessels, ships that could carry men, horses, and sealed cargo across open water. But when the king's agents looked for them, the harbor was quiet. No ships, no cargo, no explanation. The inquisitors tortured the knights for years. They asked about heresy, they asked about rituals, they asked about idols. But strangely, the records show almost no questions about the fleet. Why? Perhaps because the king already knew the answer. The birds had flown, which leads to a quieter question, a more dangerous one. If the Templars moved something, where would it make sense to move it? Not to another kingdom, not to another pope, not to another throne where power could still reach them, but beyond reach, beyond jurisdiction, beyond the authority of kings and the memory of courts, beyond the map itself. Because in the medieval mind, the Atlantic was not simply an ocean, it was a veil, and veils exist for a reason, to hide what cannot be destroyed. La Rochelle matters because it changes the scale of the question. A land-bound order can hide money in a cellar. A sea-capable order can move an archive out of reach. The Templars were not famous for navies in the way Venice was, but they did not need to be. They needed a working fleet, trusted crews, and a port that faced the open Atlantic. La Rochelle gave them that. The port sat on the Bay of Biscay. Dangerous water, yes, but also the gateway to wider routes. From there you can run south along Iberia, you can slip into Portuguese harbors, you can reach England or Ireland, and if you are bold, you can ride the winds west. A synchronized arrest operation like 1307 creates a single predictable reaction. Anything mobile becomes more valuable than anything stored. Gold is heavy, documents are lighter, and people forget that paper can be more dangerous than metal. If the Templars believed the real threat was not arrest but erasure, then the fleet was not a luxury, it was an escape hatch, a moving vault, a way to take the wrong asset away before the king could seize it. Consider the logistics required for this disappearance. La Rochelle was not a symbolic port, it was an operational hub. Contemporary records describe Templar vessels as heavy transport ships, designed for endurance, not speed. These were hulls built to carry horses to the Holy Land, and immense loads of timber and stone back to Europe. More importantly, La Rochelle operated as a semi-autonomous zone. Cargo could be loaded, sealed, and dispatched without the immediate oversight of royal tax collectors. This matters because archives travel differently than treasure. Gold attracts attention. It glitters. Documents require silence. If the Templars believed their true vulnerability lay in what they knew, not what they owned, then those 18 missing ships were not just carrying refugees, they were carrying the institutional memory of the order. Modern history treats the Atlantic as an impossible barrier before 1492, an uncrossable void, a boundary between the known and the imagined. That belief is comforting. It makes the past feel smaller, more primitive, less threatening. But it is not true. The Atlantic had already been crossed. The Vikings reached North America centuries earlier, not by accident, not by luck, by navigation. They followed stars. They understood currents. They read seasonal winds. Most importantly, they returned, which means the route was not a miracle. It was repeatable. And once something is repeatable, it becomes a possibility, a tool, a corridor. Knowledge does not disappear once it exists. It migrates, it fragments, it hides. Sometimes it hides inside institutions, sometimes it hides inside families, sometimes it hides inside maps that look like nonsense until the right eyes read them. Consider the Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral. It depicts the coast of South America with startling accuracy for its time, and it claims to be compiled from older source documents. That is the part that matters. Not whether every contour is perfect, but the idea of inheritance, the idea that older maps existed. We must remember where the Templars lived for nearly 2 centuries. During the years Europe calls the Dark Ages, the Islamic world did not stop measuring the earth. Arab scholars preserved Greek geography, Roman cartography, and astronomical tables while Europe rebuilt itself from collapse. Libraries in Baghdad and Cairo maintained navigational knowledge long after it vanished from the West. The Templars negotiated, fought, and traded within this intellectual ecosystem. They had access to knowledge that French kings did not. So when impossible coastlines appear on later maps, claiming to be based on ancient sources, the question is not who invented them. The question is, who carried them back? When modern viewers hear crossing the Atlantic, they imagine GPS and engines. Medieval sailors had neither, but they had something else: patterns. Latitude can be estimated by the height of the sun at noon, or by certain stars at night. It is crude, but it works if you practice. You do not need perfect math. You need repetition, you need records, you need men who treat navigation like ritual. The great fear is longitude, east and west positioning. But if your goal is not a pinpoint harbor, and you understand currents and prevailing winds, you can reach land without knowing exactly where you are. There is a reason certain routes were later called Volta do Mar, the turn of the sea. Sailors learned to swing wide into the Atlantic to catch winds that bring you home. This was not mysticism, it was field knowledge. Knowledge you can only earn through voyages and through the institutional memory that keeps those lessons alive. An order like the Templars had exactly the kind of discipline that navigation demands: standard procedures, chain of command, and a habit of record keeping, which is why missing archives matter so much. Because the most valuable map is not a drawing. It is a set of instructions that tells you when to leave, where the winds turned, and how to return. The Atlantic looks empty on medieval maps not because it was unreachable, but because it was undocumented. And undocumented spaces are precisely where dangerous things are moved. When the Knights Templar were officially dissolved by papal decree, most of Europe complied. France arrested them, England dismantled them, Spain scattered them. But Portugal did something extraordinary. It refused. King Denis of Portugal saw through the political theatre. He understood that the accusations were convenient, not truthful. He understood that heresy was a weapon, useful for seizing property. So instead of destroying the Templars, he transformed them. Their lands, assets, and personnel were transferred into a new institution, the Order of Christ. On paper, it was a different order. In reality, it was continuity. The same men, the same command structure, the same accumulated knowledge, the same financial bloodstream, rerouted, not cut. This matters because the Order of Christ did not fade into obscurity. It became the engine of the Age of Discovery. Its most famous patron was Prince Henry the Navigator. The phrase School of Sagres is often romanticized, but the reality is more impressive than the myth. Portugal built a system for exploration. A system means planning, funding, recruitment, testing, iteration, Jewish astronomers, Arab mathematicians, cartographers trained on Mediterranean charts, shipbuilders who learned what hull shapes survived Atlantic swells. All of it supported by money, and money matters more than myth. Because you cannot run long voyages on prayer, you run them on logistics. This was not accidental innovation. It was a state-sponsored R&D program, funded by the assets of the former Templars. This is where maritime technology accelerated. The caravel, lighter, faster, more maneuverable. The lateen sail, better at tacking against the wind. Celestial navigation, using the sun and stars to estimate latitude. These were systematic improvements. Funded, tested, improved. And history leaves a visual clue it cannot erase. Look at Portuguese sails in paintings and chronicles. That red cross, the cross of the Order of Christ, it is not proof of a secret plot, but it is proof of institutional continuity. A Templar symbol still traveling on ocean wind, still sanctioned, still protected, still financed. If the Templars possessed advanced geographic or navigational knowledge, Portugal built the ships capable of using it. But did they actually reach the North American coast? Skeptics demand physical proof. In the Taunton River of Massachusetts, there is a large boulder that has baffled scholars for generations. Dighton Rock. It is covered in petroglyphs, markings that do not match local indigenous styles in any simple way. For centuries, it became a Rorschach test for historians. Some saw Viking runes, some saw Phoenician script, some saw nothing but weathered scratches. In the early 20th century, Professor Edmond Delabarre proposed an interpretation involving Latin letters. He used photography and careful lighting to argue that certain shapes formed a readable inscription. Among the names he believed he saw, Miguel Corte Real, a Portuguese explorer tied to a family that sailed aggressively into the North Atlantic. Corte Real expeditions searched for land and people. Some of those voyages ended in disappearance. And next to the alleged name, Delabarre believed he could identify crosses, not just any cross, the cross of the Order of Christ. Now here is the responsible point. This is debated. Hard. You will find experts who reject Delabarre's reading entirely, but for our investigation the question is psychological, not doctrinal. Why do these readings keep appearing? Why do so many people across decades keep trying to see Portugal in that stone? Because the idea fits the broader pattern. Portugal had the ships. Portugal had the institutional continuity. Portugal had the motive to explore without asking Rome. If this interpretation is correct, a high-ranking member of the Templars' successor order was walking on Massachusetts soil nearly a century before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. But Portugal was not the only route. There is a darker, stranger story that connects the Mediterranean to the North Sea. The Zeno narrative. In the 1550s, a book was published in Venice detailing the voyages of the Zeno brothers, Niccolo and Antonio, who supposedly sailed in the North Atlantic around 1390. The narrative describes a prince named Zichmni, who possessed a fleet and ruled islands in the north. Many historians identify Zichmni as Henry Sinclair, the Earl of Orkney. The narrative includes a map, the Zeno map. It shows islands that look misplaced, coastlines that look impossible, but it also shows a knowledge of the North Atlantic that shouldn't exist in a Venetian archive. Critics call the Zeno map a hoax, a fabrication to give Venice a claim on the New World. But if it is a hoax, it is a very specific one. It connects a Venetian navigator to a Scottish earl with Templar connections, precisely at the moment when the Templars needed a route west. This brings us to Scotland, and to the man who may have organized the escape. Scotland existed beyond papal authority. Its king, Robert the Bruce, was excommunicated. Outlaws recognize outlaws. Henry Sinclair was a nobleman of Norse descent. He held the title Earl of Orkney. This means he controlled the stepping stones. The Orkney Islands are not just rocks in the sea. They are the Viking highway to Iceland, and from Iceland to Greenland, and from Greenland to America. Sinclair was not a romantic adventurer. He was a political survivor. As Earl of Orkney, his power depended on the sea. His loyalty was not to Rome, but to navigation, trade, and inherited Norse autonomy. He answered to a Scottish crown already in open defiance of the papacy. This made Sinclair uniquely positioned. He had ships, he had crews accustomed to cold waters, and he had no incentive to cooperate with a church that labeled his king an outlaw. If someone needed a route west that avoided Catholic Europe entirely, Sinclair was not an option. He was the solution. Medieval accounts describe a voyage undertaken by Sinclair around 1398. 12 ships, a western journey, carrying something that needed to be hidden. Skeptics dismiss it as legend, and skepticism is healthy. But then you meet Roslin Chapel. Built by the Sinclair family decades later, Roslin is a cathedral of anomalies. It is covered in carvings that defy explanation. The Apprentice Pillar, a masterpiece of geometry that legend says cost the carver his life. But look closer at the windows, there are carvings that resemble maize, corn, an American plant. Botanists and art historians argue about this too. Is it corn? Is it stylized wheat? Is it simply decorative foliage? But look at the kernels. Look at the way the husk peels back. It is botanically impossible for a Scottish stonemason to carve an ear of corn in 1446, unless someone had seen it, held it, and brought it back across the ocean. Roslin acts as a stone archive. It doesn't contain documents. It contains memory. If the fleet moved north following the Viking route, they would have made contact, and here the silence of history is broken by strange echoes. In Minnesota in 1898, a farmer named Olof Öhman found a massive slab of greywacke caught in the roots of an aspen tree, the Kensington runestone. It bore a long inscription in runic, dated to 1362. It describes an expedition of Goths, Swedes, and Norwegians on an exploration journey from Vinland to the west. We had our camp by 2 skerries one day's journey north from this stone. We were and fished one day. After we came home, found 10 men red with blood and dead. For a century, scholars called it a hoax. They said the language was wrong. They said the runes were too modern. But recent geological analysis of the weathering suggests the inscription is hundreds of years older than Olof Öhman. If the stone is real, it puts Scandinavians, subjects of the same region Sinclair controlled, deep inside North America in the 14th century. And then there is the oral history. The Mi'kmaq people of Nova Scotia. When early European settlers arrived, they were surprised to find a Mi'kmaq flag. It wasn't a totem. It was a white background with a red cross, a cross that looked suspiciously like the emblem of the crusading orders. The Mi'kmaq have legends of bearded men who came from the sea, men who taught them, traded with them, and then vanished. It is not proof, but it is a pattern. Now we move to the site that refuses to die, Oak Island. If the Templars reached the New World not to explore but to hide, they would leave a different kind of trace. Off the coast of Nova Scotia lies Oak Island. For more than 2 centuries, people have tried to excavate it, and they keep encountering the same obstacle: engineering. The money pit is not just a hole, it is a system. Early accounts describe platforms of oak logs placed at intervals, layers of charcoal, putty, and coconut fiber. Coconut fiber in Nova Scotia. That material had to be transported from the tropics, thousands of miles away. This implies planning, logistics, supply chains. And below it all lies the true signature: flood tunnels. Artificial channels engineered to carry seawater from the beach to the pit, designed to flood the shaft when a certain depth is reached. Imagine you are digging straight down. You hit engineered layers. You keep going. Then suddenly the pit breathes. Water rises as if the ocean has found a throat. If flood tunnels exist, they solve a psychological problem. They punish curiosity. They create a cost for digging. And they force a choice: either abandon the site or invest enormous resources. Hydraulic traps are not magic. They are infrastructure. Crucially, they were not unknown to medieval military orders. Crusader fortresses in the Levant used water diversion, moats and pressure-controlled gates to protect inner keeps. The Templars specialized in layered defense, structures designed to delay, confuse, and exhaust an attacker. Oak Island follows the same logic: multiple barriers, false progress, escalating cost. This is not the mind of a treasure hunter. It is the mind of an engineer trained to protect something for generations, not to retrieve it. And this is where the Templar skill set becomes relevant again. Medieval military orders built fortifications, they managed quarries, they organized manpower, they understood supply. The men who designed Gothic cathedrals were not merely religious, they were engineers, project managers. That skill set fits Oak Island better than pirates ever did. Vault builders think in centuries, pirates think in days. Oak Island is not isolated. Across North America, anomalies appear where they should not. The Newport Tower in Rhode Island, a circular stone structure standing on arches. Official history says it was a colonial windmill built by Benedict Arnold's grandfather. But compare it to a windmill. The fireplace is on the 2nd floor, the windows align with specific astronomical events. It looks less like a grain mill and more like a round church. Specifically, the round Templar churches found in Europe, modeled after the Holy Sepulchre. the Westford Knight in Massachusetts, a faint carving on rock that appears to show a medieval sword and shield, punch marks that trace the outline of a helm. Each of these artifacts is contested, but patterns do not emerge from single objects. They emerge when anomalies repeat across geography. Different places, different contexts, same discomfort. They do not fit the timeline. And history often responds to discomfort with silence. But if they were here, if they built vaults and carved stones, and what happened to them? They did not disappear, they evolved. The Templars were a brotherhood, bound by oaths, secret rituals, a hierarchy of initiation. When the order was destroyed publicly, the structure went underground, not necessarily as a single organization, but as a template, a pattern. It is important to be precise here. The Templars did not become Freemasons. Orders do not survive that way. What survives is method, symbol, structure. Skills pass quietly from builders to builders, from lodges to lodges, from fathers to apprentices. When the public institution dies, the private tradition adapts. This is not resurrection. It is transmission. Centuries later, a new fraternity emerged in the British Isles, Freemasonry. It shared familiar symbols, the Temple of Solomon, the dual pillars, the obsession with geometry and architecture, the language of light, the language of building. And when the new world began to take shape, who was holding the pen? George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere, John Hancock, Freemasons. This is not fringe, this is documented. When George Washington laid the cornerstone of the US Capitol, he did not wear a military uniform. He wore a Masonic apron. He performed a ritual that dates back to medieval stone masons. In that moment, America is not just a country being born, it is a symbol being installed. The treasure was not just gold buried in a pit in Nova Scotia. The treasure was the network, the survival of the template, a way of binding men through ritual, a way of transmitting ideas through symbols, a way of building institutions without asking kings for permission. Perhaps we have been looking at the map incorrectly. We search for objects, we search for cups and coins, but the Templars were ideologues. Consider the idea of the New Jerusalem, a society free from inherited authority, free from dogma enforced by bloodline. Francis Bacon wrote of the New Atlantis, a perfect society across the ocean, a place where science and reason could flourish, protected from the inquisitions of the old world. Ideas migrate just like people. If Templar survivors influenced navigation, exploration, and eventually Freemasonry, then the connection is not about artifacts. It is about DNA. The United States is the only country in history founded on a set of constructed ideals rather than tribal geography, a land beyond divine right, a society built on consent, a state built with explicit separation between church authority and civic authority. That idea was heresy in medieval Europe. It was a death sentence for a Templar in 1307, but it became law in the New World in 1776. The greatest vault the Templars ever built was not a hole in the ground. It was a nation. Did the Knights Templar reach America? The ocean does not answer. It swallows. The stones of Roslyn whisper possibilities. Dighton Rock offers arguments. The Zeno map offers a route. Oak Island offers engineering. The Founding Fathers offer symbols. None of it is a straight line, it is a constellation, and constellations only appear when you connect the stars. The files are open. The investigation continues. This is the Templar Files. If you believe some secrets are worth finding, subscribe, because the history you know is only the cover story.